So, good evening. I don't know how warm it is in your Zoom and YouTube. Now we're on YouTube. YouTube moment here in Leipzig. It's very hot, so I've been showering for the third time today to start this evening fresh. I know that in Berlin it's also very hot. Erica, how is it at your part of the world?
Classic mistake with the mute. It's a beautiful day here in Montreal. Actually, as soon as we're done, I'm going to race outside and sit in the hammock. But I do have a fan on me, so I hear you on the warmth.
Lucky you. Yeah, I'm so thrilled and honored to have you both here in my sort of virtual living room, because you are both so on my list of people that I want to speak with. And why? Because you both are very inspirational for my own thinking on museums. And I'm so happy that I could persuade Friedrich von Bose to come to Saxony to be the new head of exhibitions and research at the State Ethnographical Collections. And we will, I think, talk a lot about your understanding of museums, Friedrich, and how the community concept shaped your own thinking on museums, and also the ideas that you and we are both having for the next years in our developing the museum context here that we are both working in. But Erika, you're my main guest of this evening. We have never met. We have never met live, and I already want to invite you such a long. I already wanted to invite you for such a long time, because your work as an anthropologist reflecting on museums is for me very inspirational. Also because you built the bridge that I also have in my professional biography between the Jewish and the ethnological, because before I started to work at the ethnographical collections in Saxony, I was the program director in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And the main topic of tonight is, or our point of departure, I would say, is community and community of implication, where you have been thinking about a lot. And I wish we could have now been in Leipzig, and that we would have had this talk in Leipzig. It's virtual. We will also have a workshop together next week with part of our staff. So it's the beginning of a very beautiful next 2 weeks. But maybe, Erika, tell us a bit about yourself. Who are you? What are you doing at the moment? And maybe what are you going to do the next years or so, apart from enjoying a very beautiful post-corona life, I hope.
I hope. Well, thank you so much, Leontine, for this incredibly warm welcome and this great invitation. I've admired both your work and Fred's work for so long, and it's great to be able to think with you in a more extended way. And also it's so thrilling. I was so thrilled to get this invitation and also this description that some of my ideas actually influenced the way you were working on your current exhibit, Sprachlosigkeit. And so it's always like, it's an incredible thrill, you know, from sitting in one's office in the academy to feel like one's, you know, ideas have some impact in practice.
You have relevance.
I have relevance. Someone should give me points for that. I think they will. But who am I? So I'm a cultural anthropologist by training. And I did my PhD at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And at the very tail end of that, I did what was then an extremely new certificate program in museum studies, which was in no way like a pre-professional type program. It was much more conceived of as an add-on for PhD students to get people to think with museums. And that's something which completely opened up, really changed my whole sort of career prospects and intellectual landscape, I would say, because I've always been someone who sort of really felt, you know, the necessity of trying to make a difference in the world with, you know, using ideas, right? And so finding this sort of domain of museums and heritage as a place that was really kind of, you know, open to and hungry for and sort of needing new ideas has been really a focal point. And it's also actually what got me my sort of unicorn of a job, which is I now teach, and I have now, I think this is year number 15, if it's possible, at Concordia University in Montreal, which is a relatively young and quite experimental institution. And I was recruited with something called a Canada Research Chair, which is this wonderful program that that sort of tries to bring people or keep people, either keep people or bring people into Canada who might not otherwise be or stay there, and to sort of create, you know, large scale research programs in innovative ways. And so I had the opportunity to create something called Capsule, which is the curating and public scholarship lab that I founded and still direct, and to do, you know, to really try on a larger scale with my colleagues and with my students to think about, you know, how one can think with museums and curating as a mode of thinking. And maybe the last piece I'll say by way of introduction, I know I mentioned this to you just before we came on, but as of yesterday, I now I'm free to reveal the information that we were just awarded by SSHRC, which is the Canadian Social Science and Humanities Research Council, a wonderful partnership grant for a project called Thinking Through the Museum, a partnership approach to curating difficult knowledge in public. And that is going to be actually a 7-year project with, I think we have 34 team members internationally and 20 partner institutions, including some major museums and smaller museums and archives, and working around a number of cluster areas, sort of 5 thematic clusters. So critical race museology, children's museology, unsettling and indigenizing museology, museum queries, which deals with LGBT plus issues, and the cluster that I oversee, which is national heritage and traumatic memory in museums. So we are going to be working with, the sort of principle is scholars situated in the academy, working with museum practitioners and community members, and also probably a lot with artists to really creatively respond to these very crucial debates and pressures that that museums have been under to deal, essentially, in a word, with their, you know, colonial legacies and the ongoing, really the ongoing whiteness of museums and their incredible sort of elite, sort of constrained epistemologies and practices. So that's who I am at the moment, and it's all very exciting.
It sounds so enormously inspirational, and also, hey, congratulations for getting that wonderful grant. 7 years. It's also very biblical. And your reflecting on museums and trauma is of course not, again, something that ties us together, because the speechlessness exhibition, it's all about not so much the trauma per se, but more in looking at overcoming that trauma. And of course, there in that your concept of the community of implication was so enormously important. My own point of departure was at a certain moment a certain uneasiness with the concept of source community. Who decides, who is excluded, who is non-excluded, how homogenic and how static can it be? And then I started to develop in the direction of the Faro heritage community. And I thought really for a long time, hey, it's so much more open. You can decide yourself if you want to be part of that community or not. It's not pinpointed to a specific ethnicity or cultural background or even geographical space. So I felt it was very fluid. But then you said it's interesting, but it's very much on desire and choice, and it sort of leaves out people that are in more in ethical and contested terms affected, and we should look into that, or should not leave that out. And that clicked, that resonated so much, and well, talking about overcoming trauma in this particular exhibition, of course, it is a very fundamental pillar. Before especially you two start this conversation, and I wish I could make gin tonics and give them to you, because we would stay in very informal, three museum geeks talking together about what they love in their job, um, and how inspirational museums are. We asked you, dear Erica, to give us, and also the audience that is watching us or will watch us later when we are on YouTube, a sort of input on the concept, because then we all know what at least you mean by it. So I would say the floor is all yours, and then we start with your input and see how this road, where this road will take us. What do you think?
I think that sounds wonderful. However, Leontine, you said we could be very casual here. And so actually, I wonder if before I take the floor, if I could give the floor back to you just for a moment, because since I'm not able to be there, although I read, all about the exhibition, and I was able to see some images, et cetera. I wonder if you could just maybe talk just for a couple of minutes for me, and also maybe people who are watching who aren't familiar. Could you just sort of say what is the Sprachlosigkeit exhibit, and sort of what moved you to do that, just in a word? So then we'll sort of have a larger concept just to set us rolling.
Very good point. I was so thrilled with you both having you both in my virtual living room that I sort of blend out the Sprachlosigkeit. So it's very good to correct me.
And also, please tell me what that. I didn't know how to translate that in English. Is it speechlessness or wordlessness, or I couldn't find the exact translation?
Well, we had some difficulties with translating it. And in the end, we indeed decided on wordlessness, because it's very much about words, and it's also very much about poetry. And my point of departure was, I really would like to make an exhibition on the power of poetry, the empathic power of poetry, and how can this very abstract form be translated in a space. And how does this individual resonance that poetry at least brings for me helps people in an empathic way to connect with easy issues that have been traumatizing for communities, for groups, for individuals. And what is this difficult difficult, very small thread between collective and individual memory. What is that? And I really wanted to do something with Paul Celan, which as a poet was very important for me. And maybe this exhibition was also me coming from a Jewish museum context in the ethnological context and bridging the gap, and looking at where do those two forms of museum cultures meet, and do they meet, and where can they meet, and what does it mean if those two reflections and also memory cultures meet in a museum space. So it's about genocide and trauma. It's about Shoah. It's about colonialism. It's about us being speechless because we don't know how to deal as institution with the objects that we have. It's about us overcoming an institutional wordlessness. You see, I'm using both because overcoming wordlessness and by also restitute objects back to a community. And now it's the question: is it a community of a source community, of a community of implication, or are we as museum implicated as much as the community of origin as well? And so upstairs, it's actually quite, I would say, traditional museological in its way and form. And downstairs, it's much more activistic, where we gave the floor to a museum that deals with sexualized violence, and especially in Southeast Asia, the so-called comfort women, but also a very beautiful piece of work that deals with the Yugoslav wars in the 90s, where women that survived started to work with textiles to overcome, not so much to overcome their trauma, but start dealing with it. So it's a way to look at what do ethnological museums mean, what can and should they, what should their role be, and what happens if you bring poetry and art and ethnological objects together, and does that work? And I hear lots of good comments, and I also hear critique, because some people say it's not an ethnological museum. This is not how an ethnological museum works. And then I think, what is an ethnological museum? And should we not, rethink what an ethnological museum is constantly, to learn from that, also learn from our mistakes. But indeed, what I did not do, and on purpose, is to start with an object and to tell the story from the object, but that the approach was very much more the theme, or the poetry, or the artist, and then look at the ethnographical, or the collection as such. But since you haven't seen it, but Fred saw it, maybe I can ask Fred to say whether I'm completely wrong in my reflections on this exhibition, because I'm also so much an implicated subject myself as the leading curator, that it's very difficult for me to talk about it, especially here, because I was so focused on being so happy being with the two of you. So Fred, if you want to add something, and then I hope you, Erika, have a sort of feeling and then we will go on with your input.
Well, thank you. And first of all, I want to also say that I'm so happy to be part of this conversation. It's been great, Erica, to also leading up to tonight's talk. We have been in touch, and this will be one part of a series of conversations we'll be having in the next couple of weeks, especially our workshop with you. And this is really brilliant. And to your question, Leontine, I think the exhibition is really interesting and great, as it kind of plays with a tension between the notion of wordlessness, of Sprachlosigkeit, and the work with words and with language. And to me, it was when we were still in the conception phase. I was thinking about how would this work out, that poetry, especially poetry and literature, are so important aspects of this exhibition. How do you work with that three-dimensionally? And I think this is really something that this has worked out really well. And the poetry works as a connecting different histories that are being narrated in the exhibition, and it connects different collective traumas being issues in the exhibition, and poses the question, how can you work with them, and how can you overcome? And in so far, while the title is wordlessness, somehow the exhibition does the other way, works the other way around. And I think that's really brilliant. And it gives it, I mean, you're kind of, you have a lot of space in the exhibition to think about these different relations between the histories and between the collective traumas being made an issue. And not many exhibitions leave that space to think and breathe. And I think this one does. And I think this is great. And this is something that, especially in the ethnological museum context, I'm oftentimes missing. My physical, oftentimes, and we've been talking about this also in the phase leading up to the opening, what do we feel when we leave ethnographic museums? And I think many of us have shared the feeling of a physical kind of being overwhelmed by the many objects that are usually on display, by the tightness of the spaces. And I think this exhibition does the other, works kind of the other way around. It does work with collections, puts them in different perspectives. And by being not classically ethnographic, I think it poses many questions that are so important to think about, especially in the ethnographic museum context.
But it does feel a bit like self-advertisement, and I'm not good at that. So, Erika, now the floor is all yours.
Thank you. I will take the floor now. I just have to say, I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there to actually see the exhibition. It would have been such a pleasure. And something else you said a moment ago made me realize maybe there's an interesting area of overlap where we can discuss more in the future, which is you coming from the Jewish museum into an ethnological museum, and I'm thinking about ethnographic museums, so shared but different terminology. But sort of what is the space? What could be the space for Jews and Jewishness in ethnological and ethnographic museums? Of course, there's a whole tradition of Jewish ethnography, but not so much with museums. And so with traditional European ethnological and ethnographic museums, what happens when you try to bring Jews and Jewishness in, and what does that illuminate about the museum? So I'm just, note to self, let's have another conversation about what we might do there. But in the meantime, I will try to share my screen now. So let's see. Okay, so if all has gone well, you should be able to see my slide now, can you? Yes, excellent. Okay, so I will briefly describe how I came to my idea of communities of implication, which has both a practical and theoretical context. So for a quick bit of framing, my goal with this idea is to help expand the critical vocabulary of museology to try to describe a fuller experience of human-object relations, beyond viewing objects as simple signifiers of national or communal identity, as many museums traditionally have done. I think this new vocabulary is needed to face the growing crisis in the museum and heritage sector regarding debates about colonial legacies. The roots of colonial epistemology in these institutions, as you know, run very deep and continue to impose quite limited categories of knowledge and experience on interpretation, which privilege, of course, museum-based disciplinary categories over the broader life worlds in which objects are created and circulated in the context of different kinds of intergroup relations. So I was thinking about how, a kind of first generation of critical museum discourse in the 1990s framed these complex relationships around human relationships around objects in terms of entanglements and contact zones, which were incredibly productive, and some people might say overly productive ideas, but in practice, they sort of maintained a sense of political symmetry between collectors and museum professionals on the one hand, and the communities who produced the objects on the other. And there seems to be a growing sense today that the language of this language that was sort of produced or prevailed about cultural encounter and exchange didn't sufficiently capture the violence and the trauma and the loss that, that is embedded particularly in collections-based museums that tell stories about culture and history. So more recently, the broader political and emotional stakes of these discussions for marginalized communities in particular have started to take center stage. So I will touch briefly back on these kind of broad ideas at the end of my remarks, but I want to drop down closer to the ground for a few minutes, as my own story of thinking about implication begins with my decades-long slowly and fitfully unfolding personal and professional relationship with the Krakow Ethnographic Museum in Poland, which you can see here in the first slide, along with a few sort of key questions that I've been thinking about. So the Krakow Museum was established in the early 1900s when there was, of course, no independent Polish state under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the museum's focus on showcasing the ethnos, or the culture of the Polish nation, was part of a broader political aspiration for Polish independence. The museum today is, of course, also marked by subsequent ideologies layered onto it by the post-World War II socialist Polish People's Republic. So that era had to reckon with the massive demographic changes of war, genocide, and population transfers that, however tragically, turned the newly emerging Poland for the first time into an almost uniformly Slavic Catholic Polish ethno-state, which was, of course, the desires of many people. Now, before I highlight some examples that I will show you some examples of what I see as sort of curatorial failings or curatorial missed opportunities, I want to be clear here that my goal is not to single out for criticism this particular museum with whom I've really had a very meaningful and productive relationship. Rather, I'm trying to draw attention to the sort of problems that are baked into the foundation of this kind of museum. And I'll be curious in the conversation to hear, how much this sort of these sorts of issues apply to yours and other institutions. As an important aside, I also just want to mark that since I came to think about the legacies of colonial museum epistemologies in Poland, we get to see how the colonial legacies of the ethnographic museum form intersect with additional traumatic aftermaths of the Holocaust, of state socialism, and even of feudalism. So some of these also, I think, would apply in Dresden as well. Okay. For both demographic and personal scene setting, I just wanted to mention that my own grandparents on both sides came from the kind of, quote, Polish villages that the Krakow Museum's permanent galleries focus on. And as you can see from the statistic listed on the slide, it was not uncommon to have, for example, twice as many Jews as Catholic Poles in such settlements, along with other ethnic groups. In the museum, however, in the Krakow Museum, this reality of Polish Jews in the diverse roles that they played in local economies, in social life, in folk art and cultural production is almost entirely absent. However, Jews do appear elsewhere in the museum. They are present through the eyes of their Catholic neighbors, in the form of costumes and masks worn for holiday caroling, as puppets in Christmas creches, as Judas effigies that are hung, beat, burned, and drowned at Easter time, and as toy figurines who play music, read cryptic texts, and rock or bobble in a comic simulation of Hasidic prayer. You can see some of these problematic representations of Jews in the museum's collection, and a number of which have been part of the permanent display over a number of recent decades. Now, it's important to understand that the pain and violence that museums can inflict are not only part of some past historical moment of unequal relations linked to collecting practices. So much on display in museums today continues to do damage via misinformation, insult, exclusion, and the perpetuation of stereotypes. But to turn back to my idea of communities of implication, these items are also, these items in this slide are also the first of three examples that I want to show you of objects that implicate a group of people in ways that are not usually accounted for by the museum's systems of classification, or even in their interpretive approaches when curating. So here, looking at these items, Jews did not make these objects, nor are they viewed as valued heritage in Jewish communities. So these objects would not be sort of, embraced by Jewish communities. But Jews in some way inspired these depictions. And certainly the objects implicate Jews in the perpetuation of ideas about Jews. And indeed, these caricatures can be seen in shops across Poland in the form of wooden Jewish figurines that today hold coins. So this kind of stereotype is very much present in the culture today. Now, here is a second type of object of item that implicates multiple communities. This object is described in the display in the museum as a Polish Catholic terkotka, which is used in Easter ritual processions or in place of church bells during Holy Week. But it could just as easily be a Polish Jewish grogger, which is what I assumed that it was, having grown up in the United States playing with them on the holiday of Purim. Indeed, the museum has ethnographic drawings of Polish Jewish groggers in their own collection. So this is an object that could tell a challenging story of cultural proximity, exchange, and hybridity, if sometimes marked by violence. But it's curated as it is in this limited monoethnic framework, one of the object's two parallel life worlds is completely erased. The final object that I want to share is an example of a particular genre of so-called Polish folk art that was made by Polish peasants in the communist post-war era, which depicts the Nazi occupation of Poland and the Holocaust. These are very complex representations once one begins to scratch their surfaces, as the research group that I'm involved with is doing, as these works implicate a whole network of Polish, German, and Jewish collectors, commissioners, and curators in extended dialogues. These objects are both representations of a violent history, but they also record a process of encounter, to use anthropologist Jeffrey Feldman's words. or rather many encounters, both during and after the war and even today. Ethnographic museums' framings of these objects as simply Polish folk art silences the complex social relations and memorial transactions that actually brought them into being. Again, I want to stress that breaking out of the limited interpretive framings that are part of the inheritance of 19th century museum forms is a very slow process, resulting from often painful dialogues and really dogged activism by representatives of aggrieved communities who feel ill done by or ill represented by museums. After many years of my own and my colleagues' collaborative engagements with the Krakow Museum, they recently recurated some of the most offending materials caricaturing Jews, some of the stuff that I showed. And you can see here that the masks were replaced by photographs and a critical text was added. And the museum has served as a key partner in a number of critical research and exhibition projects that I and my colleagues have undertaken. Still, I cannot yet say that their optimistic slogan, "My museum, a museum about me," rings true for me, nor for other Jewish visitors who have engaged in conversation around the museum's exclusivist ethno-national framings of Polish culture. So I want to return to the sort of theoretical realm just for the last couple of minutes. Objects in museums stand at the intersection of multiple communities, intersections that historically have been complex, but also violent crossroads. And the available language of heritage fails to describe the forms of kinship that emanate from these encounter points. The development of the idea of the source community, as Leontine mentioned, is a term that's now widely used, has been really crucial in debates over ownership of so-called cultural property, as it underlies the legitimate claims of groups whose objects were stolen or misappropriated by beneficiaries of the colonial world order. But it's also a somewhat essentialist term focused exclusively on objects' origins and pointing to only one source for each object, situated in a unitary, bounded cultural community. So these are ideas that, anthropologists have sort of been breaking down as kind of not reflecting their reality. On the other hand, as Leontine also mentioned, there is the more flexible identification-based view expressed by the Council of Europe's idea of heritage communities. So this notion suggests that people may freely choose to embrace objects and sites and traditions that they value and want to pass on to their descendants. This idea, to my mind, is limited by its focus on rights as opposed to responsibilities. It completely overlooks the fact that people are inscribed into relationships with objects in unequal ways that may not be chosen. So here we can think of the whole domain of what Sharon McDonald calls difficult heritage, like Germany's Nazi-era architecture. And it seems crucial that groups cannot simply disavow the material and other legacies of violence that they perpetrated. They can say, we choose not to identify with that heritage. And much of victim or also bystander groups may disidentify with the material legacies of their own suffering. So here you can think of death camps or ruins of former synagogues in Eastern Europe or elsewhere in Europe. These things have a force that act on us through their sometimes haunting presences. So much as we may not want to embrace them, they may actually sort of stick to us. Finally, the term heritage community stresses an idea of free choice in identifying one's heritage that gets us into the problem of cultural appropriation. So not everyone has equal rights to heritage that is more directly linked to others. For example, a Plains Indian feather headdress would really be quite unethical, we could say at this point, for a non-Indigenous person to wear or certainly to profit from, because it comes with a set of obligations. So our relationships to other people's relationships with objects are a really important domain of ethical conversation. So on this terminological backdrop, I was looking for vocabulary to describe everything that lay between these poles of essential and freely chosen linkages between people and objects. Now, Michael Rothberg's notion of implicated subjects was, of course, very suggestive because it points, as he says, to how we are folded into the legacies of events that we may not have experienced directly, and the obligations that we have to each other because of this. So I wondered how these obligations might intersect with or be illuminated by objects. There are other theorists who work more directly with museums who have offered related concepts that help express this domain of unspoken relationships around museum collections. And here I'm thinking, and I made some notes in the slide, of Jeffrey Feldman's contact points, Stephen Greenblatt's notion of resonance. I see I left him off the slide. Dan Hicks's recent call for object necrologies and necrographies, and Ariel Azoulai's potential histories. These ideas help reveal how objects can be records of the sometimes painful process of encounter, as well as other ways of imagining objects' meanings that might assemble caring communities around them in the present day. From the perspective of Poland, it's clear that we need to theorize these issues in ways capacious enough to account, as mentioned, not only for post-colonial histories, but post-Holocaust and post-socialist ones, where material culture was not only taken away from people who stayed in their home places, but was also left behind by people who were murdered or fled, and thus was inherited or partially inherited by new owners in quite psychologically complicated ways. My last slide touches on the final question from my opening slide, namely, why do this work of trying to make visible the communities implicated by objects in museum collections? And here one could say many things. So, you could say that such a broad view is intellectually more thorough and more honest. You could say that it's more socially just to give diverse perspectives on objects' histories and meanings. But I wanted to add that when we're talking about such what I've come to call awkward objects related to difficult heritage, I think we might consider that thinking in this way might actually be what people want and what they need. And here is where I touch on the Dresden Ethnological Museum's current exhibition about wordlessness or speechlessness. Objects like those that I showed can function as a kind of silent speech, encoding traces of what we have not been able to say. I found in Poland that the reactions to my curatorial projects suggest that people really yearn for opportunities to voice and to listen to and to collectively witness histories that they have had no opportunity to speak, and thus no way to fully integrate or fully mourn. And here I found quite resonant a quote from the poet Audre Lorde from her essay that's included in your exhibition's Diskursbuch about the endless ways in which we rob ourselves of ourselves and each other. I think I could end maybe by saying that museums should, I hope they will, use all the tools at their disposal to make visible our fuller relationships with the material world, how it works on us and helps constitute our experiences and relationships, linking us to others in ways that push against the illusions of narrow, polarized communities that today's politicians seem incapable of imagining beyond. So I'll stop there, and I'm really eager to have a discussion about all the things that connect our thinking to each other. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, and also in the way of dramaturgical storytelling. Beautiful. Yeah. What's missing? What hurts? Hybridity. The awkward object I liked as well a lot. Yeah, and Audre Lorde, of course, talking about poetry, enormous important inspiration for us, for me as well. Before I would like to open our conversation, I have something to share with you. We have a question from the audience, and that's quite a thing. So I really would like to bring that question in, because it's I think important, and actually quite a momentum, because it's the first time we had that. Okay. Chat comment. I like that you are exploring the relationship between objects, between museums and the objects, creator communities, and I'm excited about your findings. And that was relatively in the middle of your inputs. I hope the findings were and are perceived as exciting. And again, I think the same person. In my view, the role of the curator is foremost explaining the role an object played in history, what values it represented, and how that changed over time, and including multiple perspectives. It's not really questions, but they are comments, and I wanted to appreciate that. Thank you so much for typing that in. Erica, do you want to reflect on that a bit, or do you say in a more general conversation we will try to tackle it? So do you want to directly respond, or shall we say we will mold it into our conversation?
I mean, I think maybe both. I could just say in general, I think I would say in broad terms, I agree with that. I think that the idea of collaboration, which I know is a sort of topic that we'll probably talk about more, seems really crucial. Because I think it's not only the historical meanings of objects, but also sort of the contemporary meanings of objects, and that those are not singular. And I think that those cannot be fully grasped by, a curator situated in a museum alone. And that's why, these engagements with the whole diversity of communities, not least source communities, but other ones, seem crucial to understanding the meanings, not only historical, but also the power and significance that the objects continue to have today. So I hope we can sort of keep opening that out, because in a sense, that's the domain that we're all sort of struggling and exploring and experimenting in. So what is the most capacious and the best way to do that?
Yeah, it's quite fundamental, isn't it? That's why I wanted to share it. Friedrich, do you want to comment a bit on Erica's input, and in general on what we talked about and on earlier?
Sure, I will be happy to make a start, and thank you, Erica, so much for your brilliant input. And I was struck by many things, and of course, from the very end of your talk, the possibilities of an imagining beyond. I think it's so important as an underlying question about how do we work with and against collections, and the notions of belonging those collections kind of seem to suggest. And with seem to suggest, I mean, there can be other ways of belonging, other ways of implicatedness. And I think this very much resonates, of course, with the questions that we deal with in our ethnographic museums in Leipzig, in Dresden, in Herrnhut, and especially in Leipzig right now, as we are undergoing a more fundamental remodeling of the exhibitions. And I think tonight's discussion and your input also points so much about the question, not only, and this was your primary focus, of the different possibilities of connecting to objects and to heritage, and the different possibilities of implicatedness, but also about the ways of how we frame the specific communities we talk about. And the framing, what we talk about and who we mean so much, and we all know this from the different contexts that we work from, how we frame those contexts so much has effects on those who we frame, and also on us and the relationships and how we can think of them. And this is one important part that of our museum work, working with collections, working on displays, displaying cultures, And I really like the kind of this double notion of displaying cultures, or in the very sense of this classic anthology, that we display cultures, but we also engage in a displaying culture. And so I guess this is in this double meaning, we have to also approach in a critical examination of our own conventions, because we are engaging in a displaying culture that is very much rooted in this Western museum idea of representation. And this is something that we kind of work with and against, or try to, in the Leipzig context, in the attempt to imagining beyond, to first critically evaluate what we are facing with right now. And this leads me to the question of who are those communities. When we talk about source communities, and you have touched upon this, it's been an important concept in the ethnographic museum context, because it was introduced also to acknowledge those who we are speaking about, to have the rights to claim those objects as theirs, which is,
well, even to empower, I would say.
Even to empower, you're right. And of course, fast forwarding to the very day of today, we now in Germany see political consequences of this, with the first of officially political steps towards restitution. And this is one example, are the Benin bronzes, but this will hopefully expand to other collections in other contexts. So the source community concept has been important for the museums, but it comes, as you so eloquently write in your texts, Erica, it comes with a whole set of problems or baggage that we have to critically examine. And as following many brilliant colleagues like Wayne Modest with his publication Words Matter, and they so much matter in our context, starting with the very title of our museums. Our museum is called Museum für Völkerkunde. The question is, what are better names? Is it Ethnological Museum? Is it World Museum, which I find in some way deeply problematic, because usually it's the world beyond Europe, but that's just as a little footnote. But so we have to kind of critically look at the words and how we frame those communities. And I think you've touched upon this, that the notion of community always, it has an encapsulating kind of effect. And this can be empowering, but it can also be limiting, and it can be essentializing. And in that it is problematic. And what I loved, and I will stop there because there's many other things I could say, but Leontine should also engage in some reflection about your talk. What I think is brilliant is with the notion of implicatedness. You're touching on questions of rights and of responsibilities, and I think you've been touching on this as well. You can also include the notion of effects, and who else is affected by, for example, certain displays, certain representations that we may not think of when we talk about source communities. And the implicatedness is therefore enlarged, and of course is the basis for people who may feel being implicated to intervene. And I really liked this is what maybe the last point that you said in your introduction. I really liked your
you can talk how long you want. You can take your time. Come on.
Okay, I really liked your idea of what you said before, or maybe it was even before we started recording, that institutions never change by themselves. And when we talk about what can a museum be, what can a museum's function be, it can of course be inspirational for larger questions that go beyond the museum. That should be what a museum can do, but it also has to be responsive to public criticisms. And the notion of implicatedness, I think, is a very important idea here.
Thank you, Fred. I just, it's great everything you say. I feel like that I cannot stress enough that I in no way want to undermine the significance, the importance, the ongoing importance of the notion of source communities, because that is fundamental to the incredibly important process of the restitution of cultural property to groups from whom it emanated. And I think, someone who writes so interestingly about this problematic, it's like Richard Handler talks about how, like, the ideas that certain indigenous communities, for example, use now, the terms that they use to make their legal claims may be terms that are no longer, have sort of been shown to be somewhat bankrupt from a kind of an intellectual analytical perspective, right? So they're no longer current. Anthropologists have showed that sort of these bounded communities and these kinds of ideas, that doesn't reflect the reality. However, these people are still forced to deal with in a playing field that was not one that they determined on, ones that they are absolutely in the in the one or multiply down situation in. And so it's completely fair play for them to create a term that has a lot of real political power, and it absolutely represents something incredibly important. So again, just wanted to flag like that my desire is to expand a language, in part because I think if restitution is the end point, then I think that actually too easily lets museums off the hook for more work that they have to do to make up for their quite problematic histories. So, if museums, and I'm drawing here from so many brilliant scholars whose work that I've read, if museums who decide, who get to the point where they're going to make restitution, there's a way in which that can further heroize the museum as like the good guy. They give the things back, or they propose to give the things back, which creates a whole slew of problems for people who, to whom the people who want it back, but, who then need the means to, care for it, or, and so it's something that's not straightforward. But it also, if they stop there, it stops the museum for actually having to take responsibility for the whole history and the whole contemporary legacy in which the meanings, that the reasons that they got the objects and the meanings, the ways of thinking, these whole epistemologies that get applied to projects, that get applied, to objects, can still continue, right? And so I just wanted to, to make clear that source communities is a very powerful term. Restitution is, morally, in my view, morally correct. But I think that there's a lot more that museums need to do in this process of struggling with colonial legacies. I'm not even sure I want to call it decolonization after all of the wonderful writings about how the museum will not be decolonized. But this process of self-scrutiny, I think, needs a much broader vocabulary to, and also I do believe that museums have potential, given that they exist and they have these incredible collections, to do good things with them. And I think we need more language and better language to do those things that need to be done.
Yeah, it's also not either or. But I sometimes feel that the concept of source community is also a platform for so much projection, and maybe also in a way romanticization, and at least a very much a static concept. And when a community says they are a source community, it is for me very different than people saying that somebody is a source community. So there's also for me a difference in that. But I'm completely with you when you say, and Fred and I talk about that also a lot, that for me, for us, restitution is the beginning of a new, maybe a new chapter or a continuation of something, and that we need to see it as a chance, and not it's at the end, but as a beginning. And by doing that, acknowledge our implicatedness so much. So we need that. So it's being part of this implicatedness that gives us back stuff to people who sort of come from a source or are the source or whatever, but they are of course in other ways or forms also implicated in other things. Yeah, I mean, you can be a source community and also have a totally different life. I mean, it's also very much this staticness of the concept. Like, you know, you're not a 24-hour source community person that somebody else projects on you. We have another comment from the chat, and I would like to bring it in because it's so much fun. People bringing in comments, and it's Erica and Friedrich speaking about representation and ownership and being implicated. Where would be the balance between appropriation and empathy? Hit it on.
Fred, I'll leave that one.
That's a great question, but I'd have to think about this for a minute.
Yeah, I'm trying to actually think, what does it mean, the balance between appropriation and empathy? I mean, I'm not sure. The thing is, empathy can be also quite a problematic concept. And so I'm not sure that appropriation and empathy are actually different points on a spectrum. I think that they can exist at the same time. So I think someone can feel very empathic, but still be enacting forms of cultural appropriation, you know, by sort of misusing someone else's cultural materials. So maybe maybe that's how I would see it rather than a spectrum.
Why do you feel, I totally agree with you, but why is empathy such also a very ambivalent subject, especially in the context of ethnographical museums, also maybe in the context of the museum professional working with the source community?
You know, it's something, I mean, I think that there are multiple issues with empathy. I remember there was a while ago, I was sort of more engaged in sort of thinking through that issue, because I think I've sort of settled on the idea that on the one hand, empathy is crucial and really central to all of this sort of work that we do. You know, it's sort of in some ways it's both necessary and kind of the payoff for better understanding other people's life worlds and experiences and histories. But I think maybe there are two things that are off the top of my head that are ambivalent about it. One is that one's own feelings of empathy can kind of displace somebody else's reality. It can sort of become a sort of navel gazing when it's all about, you know, one's own experience of empathizing with someone else. And that maybe sort of touches on the second aspect that is maybe problematic, which is that I'm not sure that our efforts towards justice should be linked so closely with our feelings about other people. Because, you know, it's something I remember, this was brought home to me in an interesting way when someone noted to me the difference between the etymological roots of the words for charity in Christian traditions and what's called tzedakah in Jewish tradition. So charity is charity. It comes from the root word of kur, the heart, right? And so charity is something that you do because you're moved you feel moved, and so you want to give to someone else. But in Hebrew, the word tzedakah, which is sort of the Jewish word for charity, is the word tzedek, which means justice. So it doesn't matter how I feel about another person. It's the right thing to do to give to them, to support them, to enact justice and charity, right? And so, I mean, it's, you know, mixing up the words now, but so I think just the question about, in our efforts towards justice, should it really matter how we feel, or should there actually just simply be moral imperatives that we are required to enact, even if we're not feeling particularly empathic? So that's sort of maybe some of the areas that feel tense to me.
I was focusing a bit on the word empathy, because an empathic remembrance culture, which very strongly comes from Rothberg's multidirectional memory and solidarity with minority perspectives, does play a very strong role in the exhibition Wordlessness, so that the poetry that guides you through the exhibitions, and you see those several case studies with perspectives from people, but they're not linked thematically, but it's sort of the poetry makes you maybe more empathic, and I do feel that it's a very beautiful concept, but I'm very much aware of the ambivalence as well. You know, the walk a mile in somebody's shoes is a beautiful educational tool for museums, and I really like the concept, but it's the moral imperative and the justice, and I like it how you open up tzedakah with the more charity from the Christian tradition. It is indeed different, and you don't really need to feel empathy in order to become active. I mean, it's just the thing you need to do, yeah, the moral imperative. So that's true, but I struggled a lot with that during the thinking of this exhibition, whether or not I would go along the path of empathy or not. So I sorry, I wanted to focus a bit on that.
No, you know, I think, Leontine, if I can again take your invitation of the casual interruption, I think, you know, I would love to just at some point have a longer conversation about this. I realize it really is a tension for me, this question of empathy, because, you know, there's so much pushback against this idea of walking in another's shoes, right? I mean, it assumes that that's possible, right? And that there's a kind of arrogance in assuming that one actually can grasp another's experience, and that's somehow foundational. There's a funny joke that in some of the reading that I've done around this, I remember somebody said, you know, if you walk a mile in someone else's shoes, you're a mile away and they have no shoes, right? So, yeah. I mean, it's really this question of like, who needs to feel what, and how does that feeling on our side relate to other people's experience? And I think, yeah, I mean, I find that, you know, I think there are a lot of criticisms in sort of like new agey communities about these attempts, the damage that can be done by the attempts, the need to inhabit someone else's experience, which of course, you know, creates these whole worlds of like, sort of, I don't know, poverty tourism and even volunteerism, where somehow like privileged white kids from North America need to go, you know, try to help something in Africa, where really they just actually, you know, burden other people to create some kind of empathic experiences for themselves. So again, I mean, there must be a place. I'm sure there are some very, you know, brilliant people who have teased this apart and created a, you know, sort of way that empathy can really have a powerful sort of action in the world for justice. But I think it's so fraught. It's so fraught with problems.
Yeah, and it's of course again appropriation. It's arrogance. It's the do-gooder syndrome. It's also entitledness. That's all true. But I do feel that especially poetry can, and in literature in general, that's why I connected empathy with the concept of poetry, because it's for me a way of engaging, at least emotional. Maybe it's the emotional turn, but of course emotions in exhibitions are of course also very ambivalent. But let's do another talk on that. But it does play a role in the museum context. Maybe it's also about how much is it 30% because you work with poetry, or is it an empathy in your face 90% thing? I mean, it's also about intensity, right? But what we have right now is that we say we don't ditch the concept of a community of origin. It is important, of course, in an ethnological context, but we should not stop with that concept. We should go beyond. Actually, that is what we try to figure out, right? And next week we have the workshop together. What are the questions we have, Friedrich?
Maybe before I answer that, I was gonna say one thing about one thing about empathy. I wanted to share an idea, or at least one reaction that I had was first positive. Okay, that's interesting, because empathy can of course create also a certain kind of proximity that may be helpful with engaging, but at the same time, and I was very much I found it very impressive how you so spontaneously reacted, Erica. Maybe the problem is, the proximity between empathy and identification, and how this may actually deflect from an own implicatedness. And we have this in the whole kind of post-Holocaust remembrance politics, the question of how can empathy actually hinder the descendants of the perpetrators to really deal with their families' histories, because they are so empathic with the trauma of the victims. And this is, of course, obvious. I mean, there's been so many.
Now you stressed a heavy issue in contemporary German discourse at the moment.
But this was something, and that's why I'm addressing this. This was something that I think we also discussed in the preparation of the exhibition, and we had one interesting concept by Trinh Minh Ha, which is speaking nearby. And I think I had to think about this. I haven't thought about this for a while now, but Trinh Minh Ha, introduced this notion of speaking nearby in order to critique the idea of the possibility of speaking with, or of inhabiting the position of the other. And of course, this resonates very much with the history of reflection in ethnographic work and the whole writing culture debate that we've had by the latest since the 80s. And this then again is so much relevant for our debate, I guess, about implicatedness.
Actually, Fred, if I might, a small comment linking to that. Yes, I mean, I think that it's interesting thinking about, ethnographic and ethnological museum as that, like, this is why sort of anthropology, which kind of theoretical anthropology sort of anthropology was born sort of with and in museums, and then the critical theory kind of decamped for the academy somewhere in the 1950s. And so museums have been left as these sort of treasure boxes. And then, a lot of the really critical thinking is going on elsewhere, has the opportunity to go on in universities. We need to marry these things back, because precisely this question of how has fieldwork and ethnographic research and ethnological research and theorizing been conceived and still really embedded in these museums, with ideas, yes, of sort of, kind of access and understanding and getting inside and getting in and then taking away people's shoes and bringing them back to the museum. And there's been such interesting theorizing. Of course, people like Trinh Minh Ha and like artists of color, and they're always ahead of the curve, but also anthropologists now. And I'm thinking, George Marcus has been doing interesting work over the years of like kind of trying to reposition, like, what is the relationship, what is the scenario of field work, right? Rather than anthropologists trying to sort of sit down next to, and then like, well, per Geertz, reading over the shoulder of the quote native, but like, what should be our relation? Which for me, that's also why museums are so fascinating, because it creates a space that people can inhabit sort of together side by side and looking at a third thing, and maybe having some kind of shared, I don't know, creating a relationship, a new relationship. But yeah, this idea, as you said, of speaking nearby. And I think, Marcus has these ideas of like complicity, like where our interests actually overlap, what can we do together sort of alongside each other rather than, one person trying to, as a shorthand, walk in the shoes of another. So I'm really interested in sort of what can be those possible, what are the spatial and relational metaphors? And then of course, also, as you guys are trying to reinvent your own institution, just as so many of these institutions we've inherited, what do you see as the various, if I can use that term, communities of implication? I mean, and I guess maybe we'll pursue this also in the workshop, like where would you look to start opening that out and reaching out for other interlocutors who would have meaningful things to say and meaningful relationships to build around your collections?
Yes.
It's funny, and of course, so good that you posed that question, and Fred and I were talking about that this afternoon, and like who are our communities of implication, being implicated ourselves. So we are one. I as the director am one, and I was also the institutional one, right? But in that respect, I also, and I was curious about that, how you feel about this concept of stakeholders in that concept, that implicatedness, can that also become part of a sort of stakeholder analysis of a museum? Like, I'm here in Leipzig and I'm doing a stakeholder analysis, and not from a management perspective or a marketing perspective, but from a content analysis perspective. And I'm using the concept of implicatedness in my stakeholder analysis. Would that work?
I mean, that's a great question. I would love to hear whether you think it works. I feel like there is something for me, again, not being a museum professional, that has a sort of businessy, capitalistic kind of flavor about stakeholders that somehow we have. It's like, feels like, we have kind of investments and we're trying to make good on our investment. And I don't know, I mean, in some ways, maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's not such a bad parallel, but I think stakeholder, again, it points more towards our rights than our obligation. So it talks more about what we want to get out of something than the ways that we maybe are uncomfortably connected to things. So maybe stakeholder, if that works for you all, maybe that's part of it, but I think it would need to be accompanied by terms that maybe, that point more to our obligations and our hauntings.
Or awkward.
Yeah. For sure, no. It's all awkward.
Yeah. No, I do feel you when you say stakeholder. The concept of stakeholder sounds very neo-capitalistic to me. That's why I said it's not from a marketing perspective that I was reflecting on it.
Maybe if I may jump in there, because I would like to come back to previously, Erika, you stressed again the importance of the history of talking about source communities. And what I was thinking was, with the concept of communities of implication, and that's what I found so brilliant about it, is that in a certain way, communities and implication they have an odd relationship as words. And so implication kind of counteracts the notion of community that we often kind of think it as a bounded entity, as something that has some kind of, non-negotiable boundaries in one way or the other, and that is connected to a source. And I was thinking of, and this is maybe a funny jump, but I was thinking about the notion by Stuart Hall of defamiliarizing, and of, where he of course talks he writes this in the field of visual culture, and defamiliarizing the gaze, meaning not only inventing other images that are better images, but to work critically with and against the visual imagery that we have when depicting, for example, other contexts. And of course, he argues in the field of visual culture, of advertisement, and so on. But maybe this notion of defamiliarizing somehow, at least to me, and correct me if I'm overstretching this, but it kind of resonates with working with and against the notion of community, because basically we are asking also how are collectivities being created with what we do, and how do we address publics but also create publics. It's both. We are addressing publics, and this is a problem that museums often have, that we think about the publics out there that we just have to kind of get hold onto, but we forget that by what we do, we create these audiences, and that this has, of course, critical potential, because by creating these audiences, we can try to involve them and expand also who we are, because they can critically intervene, and therefore, and this is, as we said before, so important in also institutional work. Because the pressure is always usually coming from outside, and the question is, how responsive are we to this? So maybe,
and how open are we really?
Yes.
How open really, instead of saying that we are. Hey,
exactly. This is maybe just to complete, because this was the question before. This is something I would like to work with in the workshop with the colleagues. How does this affect, reflecting upon this together, how does this also kind of reflect back upon how we think of us as an institution, and with the different departments, which is not only the custodian and curatorial department important here, but the whole administrative back end of the institution as well. So I think this is all affected by these questions, and we will have to obviously think about how we do this in the workshop. But this is something I would love to do.
I'm sorry to jump in, but we have again questions, and one is very direct or very concrete, and that's why I would like to share it. And it's pointed to you, Erika. Maybe you, Erika, could also tell us about your collaboration with the museum in Krakow. How can museums embrace, learn from and with, be more relevant to multiple communities of implications?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think it's been a very enlightening and very humbling experience working over time since I was a student, really. When I think of working with, I'm thinking of from the first moment I set foot in that museum in the early 1990s as a college student, I think, and was kind of horrified by what I saw. But I have done now one major exhibition of my own in 2013 called Souvenir Talisman Toy, which was about these wooden figurines of Jews. There I met a wonderful Polish colleague, Roma Sandyka, who pointed out that she had also found I had found a few of these sort of Nazi occupation themed figurines, which of course open a window to a whole different meaning. So then she led a project with me and two other people, one of whom is a curator in the museum, Magdalena Zich, and a wonderful photographer, Wojciech Widzik, where the more recent exhibition that we did in early 2019, Terribly Close, was about those objects, and the museum was both the site for the exhibition and sort of a partner in the research through the curator. And also I've worked with both Roma and Magdalena with students, local students at the Jagiellonian University, to do a critical intervention in the museum. And we actually published a book. It's in Polish, but it's coming out in English soon, about addressing some of the objects that I showed, but obviously a whole range of them, trying to address this sort of the repressed, the missing Jews and other ethnicities, but also sort of everything that's missing in an idealized ethnographic representation of village culture. So all of the violence, the misogyny, the hard work, the diverse social groups, et cetera. And the students did an amazing job with that. So again, that was obviously with the permission of the museum, even though it was very brief. And actually more recently, last year during Hanukkah in December, we did, working with a local arts activist institution called Festival, we did a critical projection on the facade of the museum. So we worked with 4 artists who were supposed to do sort of critical artistic interventions in the museum, but because of COVID, we couldn't actually realize them in the museum. So we simply projected them sort of large scale on the facade of the building that you saw in my slide. And that one was actually, that was a bit bumpier. It was received as a rather aggressive intervention by some people in the museum, even though, again, to be fair, the museum gave us a totally free hand on what we would project on their facade. They didn't make us run it by them first. So that shows a lot of trust that we've built up. It's been an incredibly bumpy ride because I came in, and this is stuff I've been sort of working through and trying to unpack and write about myself now retroactively. I came in, first as sort of a young American Jew with a great, the sort of re-encountering Poland as the site of my community tragedy of the Holocaust. My mother was a refugee from Nazi Europe, from Vienna, and sort of, all of the gaze and the framework and the emotions that come along with that. And then when I moved to Canada and, coming back as an anthropologist, bringing all of, my kind of saber rattling discourse of decolonizing the museum, which of course was, I was transposing something that comes from a settler colonial conditions with indigenous people doing the activism and sort of, using that as a framework to apply in a country that, didn't have colonies, but of course still inherited in very complex ways that are just now being unpacked, sort of a shared European colonial heritage in part in the form of the museum, but sort of just, the privilege that I have to come in, to zoom in with my different feelings and ideas and sort of demands for this museum. I used to be very frustrated by all of the limitations they put on me and the slowness of their unwillingness, it seemed, to change. And over time, I've realized that I might sort of flip the script a little bit and think how grateful I am at what they actually let me do, the constraints that they have been under, and especially in recent years, the incredible political constraints with this very right-wing government, and the risks it is for the museum to even try to engage with my critiques and enact some of my ideas. So it's been very humbling, to hear, for example, that my desires or attempts to decolonize the Krakow Ethnographic Museum may be seen as a colonial gesture by the curators and the local people there, right? And so there's been a lot of learning that's taken place. If you actually, for the person who asked the question, if you Google my name and either the words "terribly close" or "souvenir talisman toy" or what was this last one called? Shedding Light on the Museum. You can see a lot of images and documentation of those exhibitions. And it's also something that I write about. My work is on academia.edu for anybody who wants to download the articles where I've described some of that work, and some of it I'm doing now. So thank you for the question. And that's just in very brief, I think, bringing us maybe to the end of our time, what I've tried to do and what I have learned and I'm still learning about what this wonderful mentor of mine, Ray Silverman, has called slow museology. So I'm really on board for the like any relationship, you have to really be in it for the long haul.
It's relationships need one thing, and they need more, but they need one fundamental thing, and it's time. It's time, absolutely. I really liked the fact that you were reflecting on those constraints that we in museums have, and those constraints are massive. They are, of course, the amount of people we have and the amount of budget. They are enormously historically framed. There are demands of the contemporary world banging at our door or in other ways. So it's we're not a free floating text, and that's sort of, although I love Mika Ball and I really like her, her looking at museums exhibitions as text and criticizing them without sort of acknowledging the constraints. And I'm not saying that out of a easy way out, but it I think an informed museum critique needs to integrate those constraints, and that's why I really like the fact that you said that you also as a scholar have changed and look, and that you look at your critique now also differently than a few years ago, and that you're now seeing that the museum actually tried to enable you so much in the context of what they were able to do, and I think there's a value in that sometimes is overseen by a lot of people who critique the museum, and that also creates a lot of hurt by museum colleagues, and especially colleagues that have been in a museum context for already such a long time. And I sort of can understand both perspective. And I have to and also acknowledge both of them.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to stress, I in no way want to leave these 19th century museums off the hook in terms of the damage that they still do with their categories, their representations, their collections, right? And so again, I mean, I want to honor all of us on all sides of this. We are constrained by this huge infrastructure. So it's more like the human relations understanding. Not everybody inside. I certainly wouldn't agree with everybody inside the museum that I've been working with, or any museum, but simply, yeah, just I've gained humility over time about simply what is possible, and also just the fact that there are reasons why we have very different viewpoints. And so I still do want to sort of maintain the demand that that my view, and that people whose communities are hurt by museum representations, that's a major social justice issue. I'm just acknowledging that that on an individual level of people working for change is really hard. And so I'm sort of that's almost like the core of my interest now, even intellectually, is how do museums change? Like, how does change actually happen? And I think that that's an area that's both fascinating, and it's also really necessary to understand. If you do feel like you demand that museums change, you need to know how that is possible, right?
That's indeed the last question, and I thought it would be a very beautiful question to end our conversation with, and maybe also link it to our workshop of next week. Thank you for the wonderful conversation. So a compliment to both of you. Could you speak a bit about processes of change in and with museums? And I thought, whoa, how much time do we have? I mean, that's a conversation that I hope will never end. But maybe we could connect it with our wish for next week's workshop. Could that be something, Friedrich? The process of change in and with museums, and what do we want from that workshop? What would be something that you would like to take out of it, or bring in our dealings with Erika, in order to develop as an institution that is changing, but slowly.
Slowly, yes. This is a brilliant question, and I like the question because it's posing in and with museums, and
Yeah.
thereby was already kind of, you know, questioning the clear boundary of the museum, what is, you know, the institution itself. And we are, as we said before, as we agreed before, we are very interconnected with the world outside the museum, necessarily so, but also in the way that we have to be responsive of what we are expected of, and what is expected of us. And the critique often comes from outside. And I want to quote my dear colleague Nora Sternfeld, who brought this brilliant sentence: how can the critique of the museum can have effects in the museum? And I understand the question very much in the sense, in and with museums. So, and this is, of course, connects to the issue of communities, of implication of how do we talk about who we work with. And I think one aspect that I hope for this workshop to sharpen our ideas is who are the communities that are important to us, and how are the ways of engagement that we think, what are the ways of engagement so far to reflect upon our collaborations in the process that we have been undertaking so far. And I'm talking also about, as someone who's been here, as you mentioned, Leontine, only since like 8 or 9 months. So I'm still also in the process of learning of the history of working with communities outside the museum, but also how can we expand notions of criticality, you could say, in this collaborative endeavor. In what does collaboration mean? And yes, of course, what are the limits? The limitations, we need to be aware of them, but they can't be, we can't be sorry for ourselves at the same time. We shouldn't be, at least. So how we talk about, not only, we work with collections, but we also work with people. And how do we talk about objects and subjects we work with, and what are the relationships we engage in, and how can we be constantly also, how can we let them interrogate us, and how do we frame the relationship between who are they and who are us? These are all questions that we need to tackle in a process that we are already in, of course, as we have been in the last half year. And Erika, you know this from our previous conversations, talked a lot about questions of categories that we have, that, the whole baggage of categorization that we have to deal with anyhow. So this comes into this process of reflection, I think. Yes. I don't know if I answered the question. That is a brilliant one, but this would be my take on it.
I thought your answer was quite brilliant as well, and I like the concept of humbleness. And earlier, Erika mentioned also being more silent as a museum. And I think that's very important. Just maybe you should sometimes shut the fuck up a bit, and just and don't talk so much about yourself, that you're so great because you're now returning objects and you're now participatory working and you're now so very much a forum. Sorry. And you're now so dialogical. I mean, it's not about us here, we're very much implicated, and we have to take our responsibilities and not saying we are taking our responsibilities and we are so good at taking our responsibilities. It's I see the way museums are dealing with their colonial past. It's also very much in German remembrance discourse, like, we are well, I don't want to bring that up, but it does resonate. We are very much We are very much taking responsibility of our past, and we're the best in the world of taking our responsibility in the past that we did in the 20th century as Germans. You know, we are. It's actually quite extremist, and we should, you know, we should be more silent and yeah.
You know, could I add, Leontine, to that? That I think, I mean, this question of change, I think that change in museums, I'm convinced that it always comes from external pressure, or you know, and I actually have a recent.
So you don't believe in the long route through the institutions, the path I took? You don't believe in it?
No, I do, but I still think that ultimately the catalysts are sort of outside pressures that are building up in different ways. And I think, you know, we were talking about this a bit before we went live about, I'm so interested in this idea of collaboration with museums. And I actually have an article that's coming out in this like memory activism journal, where I was sort of trying to map out what are these moments, and sort of moments, but also angles of pressure that have caused museums to change, or where people have tried to get museums to change. And I think, you know, you can almost map it on a spectrum of like, what's the word, consensual collaboration, to sort of very guerrilla, you know, kind of attacks, right? And in some ways, actually, I realized that academic critical writing about museums is almost the ultimate guerrilla tactic, because you're safe in your own bunker of the academy. You have there's no consensuality there. You're just looking at something often from afar and just throwing grenades, right? But as I've now inhabited multiple points on this spectrum, I'm sort of realizing, like, you know, artists, for example, they kind of go in, and now increasingly they're invited to come in to kind of meddle with or mess with the museum, right? And on the one hand, those things can be incredibly powerful, but they're also, you know, there are ways that they can start to get co-opted, and again, just be to the glory of the institution, and sort of the critique can be neutralized because it's so aestheticized, right? And so
repressive tolerance in a way.
Maybe I think I need a whole language of psychotherapy here to, like, you know, unpack this, but yeah, I think that's the thing. And is, you know, touching on what you just said about this debate now in Germany about this kind of sacralization of Holocaust memory, I think the issue of change happens when you're committed to remaining constantly responsive to, you know, the expanding critiques, and to hearing the voices that are the ones that have not been invited to the table, right? Hearing the people who have something to say but have not had that voice at least amplified, or you know, sitting at the big table. So yeah, I think, you know, collaboration, but also critically exploring and interrogating what's possible, and when, you know, what kinds of collaborations actually can be constraining, and when it's actually just good to have people throwing grenades. I mean, I feel like all of those opportunities from, and as there are circuits of all of us moving through these spaces, right? I mean, we get trained, sometimes someone's an academic, maybe they become a curator, maybe they're a critic at certain points. Like, you can enact these things differently, and I think with different affordances and constraints, you know, based on that your subject position kind of in the infrastructure at the moment, or in relation to the infrastructure at the moment. So I think there's a lot to do there, but also sort of a lot to unpack and pick apart, and understanding what are the mechanisms that do produce change, and lasting change, which has as much to do with how we think about things as, you know, procedures for things being done. So,
and maybe we can do sort of relational mapping also during the workshop, that also make that visible in relation to also our the question of who are our implicated communities, and maybe there is also a link between the two. I think there is.
We'll find out.
Yeah, it's a beautiful research question. My dears, I look at the clock, because I try to be as open and fluid as possible, and still I'm a bit a control freak as the moderator. We are a bit over time, but we didn't really have a time. So it wasn't. But I thought maybe 1.5 hours if everything goes well. But it's already 8:45, so we're doing. I think time flew, at least from my perspective, and it was such an enormous joy with the two of you. And I hoped it would be. And it was. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you so much. And we had questions, and they were all very brilliant. And I'm very grateful for the questions as well. And everybody who stayed and watched, or everybody who will look at this at some other time via YouTube. Thank you for being in our interrelational web, being implicated with us this evening. Thank you so much. What is the time now for you, Erica? Can you go out and have an ice cream or something?
That's a fabulous idea. There's a nice place right around the corner from me. I'm definitely going to go outside in any case. But thank you so much for this, Leontine and Fred. It's so fun to be in conversation with you. It's really productive, and I'm so looking forward to the workshop and maybe future things we can do together. So let's keep the conversation going.
Shall we wink? Shall we wink to our audiences and then say bye? Bye.
Bye. Take care.